So my name is Cuán McCann. I use he, him pronouns, and I want to start this talk by telling you a little bit about who I am through what I've been through and the heartbreak I've been through with community engagement. Let's see, sometimes my slide deck is a little sticky. There we go. So once upon a time, about 10 years ago, I had spent several years working in nonprofit spaces. And although I played many different roles, and these were primarily brick and mortar nonprofits that did policy work, but also tried to cultivate community connection where they were. Although I played many different roles at these places, I often wound up being the community manager. And by 2014, I was working at some nonprofits that were trying to revolutionize democracy using technology, and also expected us to have an incredible community component, be everything to everyone, have the center where we are be a place that people could just come and exchange ideas. And as I was running community programming, I found that, sure, that was true for a few folks, most of whom looked exactly like the rest of our staff, which was primarily white cis men. It's a very tech space. It's the early 2010s. This is who was getting invested in. This is who was getting invited. And I found that there was a lot of pressure on me without it being even directly stated, right? And this is within a white majority organization that and a white leadership space, to diversify who was coming in, to change who we are talking about in terms of connection. And they meant diversify in any way you could think about it. So diversify racially, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of place. And what stuck me as I looked around my organization, which was not unique, was, again, we were doubling down in activities and messaging and outreach that were just for the people who were already at the org. And we weren't doing anything in terms of how we were connecting with other communities and other community spaces. So to say this another way, in case this isn't picking up, we're supposed to have this rich community landscape, but all we do is sit at home and just have the same people over within our space. And around the same time, this amazing picture before you was just coming into being. This is a shot from the 2014 DC Funk Parade. And this was really unique for Washington, DC. Before this even happened, the idea that we would have a parade that doesn't have the big parade guards up, which is I don't know how it is where parades are where you are, but like in DC, there was a clear line between the audience and the folks in the parade. I live in Baltimore now. That is not true. You can kind of join the parade. And so to be organizing this space was really particular. And it was also funny to me. There's this big tens of thousands of people thing. I was approached by some of the organizers and they asked me if I would run a hackathon at the Funk Parade. And if you all were working in libraries in 2014, maybe you remember, everybody was trying to do a hackathon everywhere for everything, trying to get these tech people in these spaces. And this really hit me because I was like, we're going to do this amazing street festival, but you want me to once again sequester the tech people off into a room by themselves? No, I will not give you a hackathon, but I will take this challenge and think about it a lot. And so I gathered together a group of folks who don't just do digital technology, but a few other means, and several artists. And we came up with the idea for a space that, sure, could organize community technologists, but that was also part of the Funk Parade. And that space was the Tech Embassy. Just a little shout out. This was something that, again, like I catalyzed, but I did not do alone. That's my mama, who happened to be in town and wound up tabling and drawing folks in. We very tongue-in-cheek named this space the Tech Embassy, thinking about like opening up diplomatic relationships between this big street fair and these people that often sequester themselves away. What we ended up actually creating was kind of like a science fair, but built into the parade infrastructure. So if you were just walking down the street, you grabbed a drink somewhere else, you could come inside, get some shade, you could play a game of Scrabble. It was a very stimulating space. So if you were overstimulated, you could just like have a moment of quiet in the corner. If you wanted to check out around the room, we had folks tabling in age anywhere from 12 to 92. literally, on all sorts of different technology. So sure, we had your local civic hackers, but we also had these 12-year-olds who had learned GIS in order to map the food deserts where they lived. We had a group of artists who were creating LED jewelry so you could decorate yourself and go back out on the parade route. We had some artists who set up this technology should wall to have conversations around like, what the heck are we even talking about when we talk about tech? They want us to think about apps. And in 2014, this was a big deal to have these kind of conversations. And what it was also a big deal for me personally, because the effort that went into creating the space, and it was wildly successful by the metrics that anyone would look at, right? We had 400 something people in here, blah, blah, blah. But what mattered to me is to organize this space. I just did what I would do in my spare time when I did community art projects. I just did everything I wouldn't do if I was planning a community engagement program for my workplace. I thought about the context. I thought about details of the who as opposed to just a blob of the public. And organizing this at this intersection between what had been my private life and my work as a community engagement person was a pretty major shift for me. And I began to poke more. Why is it when I'm in these professionalized spaces of community engagement or professionalized expectations of community engagement, that it's supposed to look one way, that we can talk about it one way, and we're missing out on things that I think people would skip over because they're considered simple or simplified. And this opened up everything. This kind of catalyzed how I came to you now as I began to do research and have conversations with people who may or may not use the language of community engagement, but were working deeply within and as part of their communities and doing stuff, whether that was offering support services, sharing resources, catalyzing for collective action. My research connected me with everyone from high school science departments, unions, nurses, radio producers, but like literally the people who build the radio towers, as well as the folks on air, librarians, universities, and on and on and on. And what I found as I was talking with all these different folks were that while there are strategies and things that we were using and things that we can teach and share with other people, everything really came back to this notion of building with and not for. And it's easy to hear this as kind of a catchphrase. And this is my reveal for the whole talk. This is very literal. This is the key to anything else I can teach you or share with you. It is literally shifting from modes where instead of just doing something in service or on behalf of someone, we are exploring how we are operating with our communities as part of our communities. That's my reveal. We're going to come further into that, but if you zone out for the rest of it, that's the thesis, that's the whole thing. I'm not the first person to say this phrase, build with, not for. It shows up again and again and again, from Paulo Freire to many designers have used similar language. It's shown up in different languages well before English was phrasing it this way. And I think I name that also, besides proper citation, to say that that to me is part of the power in this phrase. It is this notion that we do need to keep regrounding ourselves in. As part of my research, I compiled this book that I did not name. Did not name this Experimental Modes of Civic Engagement and Civic Tech when I was using a different name at the time. And even the process of compiling that book, I attempted to do in following these methods and following this work. And in the years since the formalized research part of my work, I have gone on to work with local governments, more unions, more nonprofits, many other spaces in trying to explore what does this actually look like? How does this actually shift our practice? Which is what we are going to talk about. There we go. And in terms of like how I approach my work, I'll just say that I do everything from coaching work and facilitation to, as Meg was saying, workshops and retreats and design support. And what that has looked like in my practice has been everything from supporting brick and mortar spaces, like this is Woolly Mammoth Theater in Washington, DC, in redesigning their approach to their community programming, to working with co-ops. This is a tech co-op, Throneless Tech, that I've done a number of work with online in these Zoom days that we are deeply in. To back into my personal life, I practice what I preach. Outside of my work doing this, I am a martial artist. I teach my ancestral martial art, Bethadach. It's an Irish martial art form. And as I teach within my own trans and queer communities, I follow the method that I'll be talking about today. This is how I bring folks out, and this is also how I make this work sustainable for me. And so my other reveal for this talk is, as we talk about people, we are also people. And figuring out how to hold those two things at the same time is a major part of the shifts that we need within our work. What I have found in some 17 years or so, I have been in some form of this practice, is that there are, and Meg kind of hinted that I'm the kind of person who goes deep into these definitions, so get ready to come on this ride with me. There are two words we really take for granted having meaning when we talk about community engagement. And we say them to each other and it seems like they make sense, but I really want to challenge us to look at them in a different way. And I think that a lot of our pathway to doing this work differently lies here. And those two words are community and engagement. Who is the community that we're talking about when we're throwing this word around? And what do we mean when we're saying engagement? If we were in the same room together, we could probably talk about this in real time, and we would come up with some definitions that look the same and some that are very different. And I want to get us reacquainted with what engagement is by first talking about how we hear it, how it shows up in many spaces, how maybe you even heard it reading the blurb for this talk. Often when we are talking about engagement, we will talk about it in phrases like this. These are all quotes from things that I have written, because I am not above this work. I am also deeply within it. Our work engages residents, our programs engage the community, our tools engage neighborhoods, right? This is going to seem like a semantic point, but it's not. I don't know what these things mean. If you were to just say this to me, I actually don't know what you did, and I don't know who you did it with. I have like vague categories, but I can't, even in greater context, it would be hard for me to figure out like which people were involved, how long were you working together, what actually happened. When I hear this, this is part of like my own madness in talking with other community engagement professionals, and this is really what plagued me in the nonprofit space I worked in. I don't understand it. We're doing a thing with a vague group of people. Within this frame hides a strategic shift that has happened in this work over time. To say that slightly differently with more clarity, if you're used to seeing engagement like this, I believe it is because, especially over the last decade, engagement has become another way of talking about marketing. It's a way of talking about messaging to your community. And that's kind of it. I think about marketing as a primarily one-way communication pathway. That is where we, the big red dot here, are going to tell something to a broader group. There is some we and there's some dispersed group. And they might be able to give us some input back. There might be some dialogue. They could maybe come to an event. They could maybe give feedback on something that is already happening and honestly will happen regardless of whether or not they give feedback on it. But the primary direction of our exchange is us to them, right? That's marketing. So much of the best practices that I've seen on community engagement come back to this framing. And I get it. It's about protecting the institution. It's about working within the fact that most of us are employed in traditional systems where we have an employer that we're doing work on behalf of. But I would argue that this is not engagement. When I think about engagement. When I think about what got me into doing community work, it was because of the interconnectedness of community. I wanted to feel that connection. I wanted to see my communities using the resources of the places I worked, and what that would look like if we were just doodling together on paper. It would look like what's here on the right side of the graph, right? It would be messy. It would have many different types of connection. It would be something that I have come to think of as idealistic, but I don't think that it's idealistic anymore. I think it is just a different way of operating than the type of things I was told was doing engagement before. Yeah, there's so much I want to say on this point. And I think some of the heartbreak of like coming into the work that we do with a lot of bright eyes, bright ideas, I really want to be deep into the collaborate end of the spectrum. This is just to name, this is a spectrum that I developed in my work, particularly with local governments, but I think applies even with non-local government entities, to just visualize the types of exchanges and dialogue we're talking about when we're talking about communal interactions with an institution. Don't even worry about the labels. I actually find that it's the circle dynamics that mean the most to me and might be meaningful to you. And yeah, and I'd be curious, with more time, and maybe we can talk about this at the end too, in your own work with community, where your ideal fell, what your mind's eye image of what you'd be doing was going to be. I think we can agree that the reason why most of us aren't able to formally within our community services do work that exists on this very dynamic two-way engagement side of the spectrum comes from a lack of time, whether that's time within a week, time within a favorable political condition, whether that's we are the only staff person who has this, right? Really limited capacity. Having really strict expectations from funders that seek a very quantified notion of our community connections. Whether that's also pressure that comes from the public that we serve itself. Often the communities we work with, as I'm sure you all know, have very contradictory messaging to us as institutions on what we should be able to provide and when. And although I think there is a deeper root that I will name to how we end up in these spaces where we are really defaulting into the kind of one-way type of engagement, and maybe that messier collaboration engagement on the side, I do want to just acknowledge a lot of it is driven by very real scarcity and isolation. There is a lack of resources. There is a lack of support. At the same time, and partially why I think my experience in the tech side of things is really important, there is so much pressure from funders, from people that could offer resources to do things in a very, very now way, very tech-centric, very figure out how to be relevant on the latest platforms. A lot of pressure. I thought this was so funny, to be efficient in our community work, but I'm like, those are two antithetical concepts. They do not go together. But a lot of pressure in this to perform. And I just want to take a minute to acknowledge these pressures. As I said, there's a pressure to quantify, to really justify our community work through numbers, and through numbers that we can measure and show that are growing in a linear way, some kind of linear notion of impact. There's that pressure I mentioned of being relevant and of being ever new, like you constantly needing to invent something as though we have to capture the attention. I hope some of this is also pricking your ears for where marketing language has filtered into how we're thinking about engagement. We have to be constantly innovating. There's a pressure to solve everything and save everyone. That comes, I think, both externally and also jumping down to this last point here too, internally. When you interface a lot with the public, there's a pressure to be responsible to the people that you love and serve and that you're in relationship with. And we also feel a pressure to be neutral, to somehow not have an opinion, as though that is a neutral thing, and neutrality isn't itself a charged choice to make, and one that I think librarians in particular put into a very strange position on. And when you combine these pressures and more together, of course, you will choose/be forced to choose a pathway of community outreach that makes things simpler, or seemingly simpler. I know this is not simple work at all, but I say this to say, of course, we're going to choose the thing that looks finite. You know, we send out the newsletter, we host an event, the things that are concrete, that maybe feel safer, again, referring to safety in a number of different ways, from maybe even in relationship to our communities themselves, to our political environments. We're going to choose something that has a very clear channel. And to me, that's making that choice, again, whether there's pressure to or not, to do that one-way communication, to kind of fall into these marketing patterns. And I need to name that these pressures, even the kind of commodification of community engagement, the pressure to treat it like marketing, this is coming from a systemic issue. This is a multi-field issue. I'm trying to acknowledge what I know about libraries in this talk, but my work exists across several different fields. And it is the same everywhere. Actual community engagement, that really messy collaborative work that we saw, the thing that I know for me was what got me into this work, and maybe for you, the worth of that is systemically undervalued. Undervalued in terms of people who have resources to share, so like our funders, but also undervalued in a complex way, I think, so in the social environments we're in. And as part of that, the labor involved, the amount of work you have to do for real community engagement, as you all know, that is underestimated. And although I really want to say that the potential is misunderstood, I actually think it's feared. And this is particularly by those with resources. I think that the potential of what happens if we actually shift our work into these deeper community collaborative ways of working, actual engagement, I think that is feared. And as a result, all of this work is underinvested in. I have yet to meet a community engagement team that's doing real community engagement that has all the resources they need. And as a result, we are exhausted. You know, we're pushed into these marketing approaches. And I just want to name, like, it's really lonely work. I'm so grateful to see you all having points of connection as you do here. But I know on the day-to-day, in my own experience, it has been really lonely. And when I've tried to do things anyway, and outside of my grant cycles, outside of my work hours, it has just contributed to my exhaustion. It has honestly just contributed to my isolation. I don't name these to bring us to a fatalist point, but I just want to acknowledge, as much as I can, the reality of what you each may be facing, which I know is going to be even more complex and individual to where you live and what you're going through. And as I begin to offer other ways of operating, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to tell you that, like, oh yeah, do this for 1 month and it's all going to be different. Instead, I want to offer that as we shift our modes of operation, as we work from the root, we begin to alleviate this interconnected system of pressure and pain and loneliness that also impacts us. So it is going to be a pain in the butt. And I think it creates a much more dynamic shift. And the beginning of that shift is coming back to this question on what the heck I mean by engagement. If engagement is not marketing, if engagement is not being really exhausted and lonely and sending my newsletters in the darkness of my office when I already have 7 other things to do, what is engagement? The way I talk about engagement in my practice is as follows. I think about engagement as the ongoing act of making connections between people to each other and people to a topic. And I'm going to save you writing this down. This is the long version. Here's what I'm trying to say. Engagement is relationships. Engagement is the process of being in relationship, of cultivating and creating relationships, of caring for and repairing those relationships. And this might seem so simple, and I hope this feels like a duh moment, but it is actually a very profound shift. Because when we recenter engagement as relation, as caring for each other, we shift the priorities, we shift the strategies we would use for care, we shift our metrics for success, we shift what we value, and we naturally refocus on people, not as a blob of the public, but as people we can name, because relationships happen between real beings. So yes, the people that you serve will have a relationship with the library, but they will also have a relationship with you. And when we can talk about it in these terms, we also get to talk about what we need to be in this work sustainably. We get to talk about our capacity. We can do so much from here. And we also really change what our outreach looks like, what kind of programming we do. Relationship is a two-way process. Anyone who has sat next to somebody on the bus knows that somebody just talking to you is not a relationship, right? There is a mutuality involved in relationship. There's that interconnectivity. Relationship is the process that we get to. Being in relationship is how we collaborate. I can't collaborate. I can't take a collective action with you if we haven't met, if we don't have some type of connection together or some interconnection between us, right? It literally wouldn't happen. I would just go about my day. You would not even be able to ask me the question. We have to have some type of relationship. So the work that I do when I'm thinking about community engagement begins with this. It begins with that relational care. It is a relational approach to community engagement. And I'm going to say some scary words to you. Relational care is community organizing. I know that language can be really charged for folks and it has many different meanings, but here I just want to name that the type of community organizing I'm talking about is called relational organizing. It's an approach to community, it's an approach to organizing where the goal is to care for your relationships. It is an entire method of organizing where you create more interconnectivity and you share skills, and thereby you are just creating more community, you're creating more relationship. So in this work, to me, this is how we go beyond tokenizing. This is how we go beyond a notion of community as like coded language, and how we really get into the work of community as the people around us and the spaces that we are also part of. What that looks like for us in practice, this comes back to the research I did earlier. Most of the strategies for this work, and there's a whole approach to how we would do planning, et cetera, but I will just tell you, if this is the only time we get together, that most of our strategies come back to this notion of meeting people where they are. And the complexity of that, I think for you as folks who do often have brick and mortar spaces, is that you are at the meeting point for where folks are, and people exist outside the library as well. It's an exchange of how we meet people where they are, literally. And I'll just name check for the chaotic photos here. After that first year at the Funk Parade, I mentioned that at the Tech Embassy, we had a lot of the quantifiable metrics of good community thing that happened. But to me, what was really profound that happened are the things that happen in the years following. One of those things was the creation of Robot Disco, which was another tech community space that got woven into the parade, only this time at the end of an education space that was primarily done to teach people robotics. They could also make robot costumes. And if you look at the bottom right, at the end, we collapsed the space and we all became a parade crew, and we went and marched in the parade as part of our cleanup. that might not be the kind of success metric you're looking for. Other things I can share, the youths that gave that presentation on their food deserts went on to actually teach at a local law school, still as children. They were just brought in as guest speakers and kicked off an entire project on food deserts through one of our universities. Many friendships were formed that day, which led to a huge number of collaborations with local artists and technologists in our city. And I say this to say that the harder to quantify things were all the product of relationship, many of which are continuing on to this day. So I just have a few more points for you, and then I will wrap this up. But when I'm talking about meeting people where they are, as we begin to think about this in terms of our strategy as a different way of working on community engagement, I say meet people where they are literally, and I mean that in terms of 4 rough categories. We meet folks where they are socially, so within the networks that people have that are communal, within their friendships, within their social spaces. Physically, again, this is the library one of the library cheat codes, but in the physical spaces that people go to for work, play, and third space. Technically, which refers to the tools and technology people use. So why would we be on, well, TikTok's a terrible example because the kids are on TikTok, but actually using the platforms of the people that we're trying to connect with. And we meet people where they are on equal terms. We think about the power dynamics, particularly the institutional to community power dynamics. We think about turning up for others as we would have them turn up for us. In this, I really think we're thinking about deepening that relationship and shifting from an extractive process where the institution is getting something from people to what we are exchanging as a community within a community. From alongside this approach, we have a very thorough approach to planning that comes back to recentering on your who and why, which I think of as a little callback to our question on who is our community and why are we doing engagement? What are we trying to accomplish within engagement? And this approach also, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation, really accounts for the fact that we are part of our communities, that those of us who are instigating or attempting to catalyze communal connections, we are community members. And that knowledge should and does shift our approach as we care for ourselves while caring for others. If these themes are feeling savory to you and you want to go deeper, there's only so much I can really bring up in this space. Meg and I are going to be hosting a 2-part workshop to go deeper into this on March 23rd and April 6th. And as part of that work, you'll be invited to actually bring a real world program, project, other of your choosing. And we'll be applying the particular Build With approach to this work throughout that time and going deeper on all of these themes. But I just want to end our time here on this notion of coming back into our why and the real core of this work. We do community engagement. I really believe, I'm gonna say something on behalf of all of you that I hope will feel true. We do this work because we need each other, right? We do community work because we are communal creatures, and also we need each other. We need to be in a space of sharing that is living communally. And I hope throughout this talk that for those of you who are in this practice already of building with and not for, that I have affirmed the things that you do, whether or not you get to do them as part of the main part of your job, even if you're doing them on the side. I just want to shine on you because I know it's hard. And if you've been feeling that itch, and if you've been feeling that lonely and you're looking for something else, I hope you're also feeling welcome here and in the fact that there are more possibilities for us in how we can approach this work.